Welcome to this installment of Business Battleground. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the long-term likelihood that the FAANGs will stay in the content game. Now, initially, FAANG was the acronym for Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google. Eventually, there was a second A added for Amazon. And in this video, we're going to add S for Snap. But to go through the rundown, we're going to go alphabetically. So let's start with Amazon. So Amazon basically got into the content game in 2006 with the launch of Prime Video. Some of the shows that they greenlit, that they own the IP to, include Transparent. Over the years, they've also gotten into sports with the rights to NFL Thursday Night Football, as well as Premier League and many other sports. I think long-term, Amazon is seen as a company that will probably get a bit deeper into sports as those rights come up, and also as Walt Disney's ESPN faces a bit more pressure, both from a loss of subscribers, but also the rise of DAZN that is seizing a lot of those rights. In any case, Amazon's an interesting case. They also own the rights to the adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, the TV version. But it remains to be seen how Jeff Bezos and Amazon views Prime. I don't think anybody views Prime to be a standalone profit center that is expected to swim on its own. If you think about it, the whole raison d'etre of Prime Video is more as an incentive to get more consumers to pay for Prime next day and same day shipping, which today is a major driver of revenue and market share for Amazon. Scott Galloway has famously said that Prime is essentially a midlife crisis for Jeff Bezos, which is a bit savage, but it's not that false. Look, the reality is, when it comes to LA and Hollywood, everybody kind of goes, oh, so Hollywood, they look down on it. But everybody is drawn to Tinseltown. There's something, if not about celebrities, I would say more that about how Hollywood captures everybody's imagination from the time you're a little kid to the times when you're a bit older and you use entertainment as escapism. So I don't think necessarily like that Jeff Bezos needs Hollywood to land women as a midlife crisis. I think it's more just, when you're in retail, and it's kind of a boring nuts and bolts margins game, I think there's something sexy about Hollywood. And I think, Amazon will stay long-term in this vertical, but I don't think that it'll ever be seen as a profit driver. I think it's basically more as a means to an end to get more Prime consumers. So long-term, I'm pretty bullish that Amazon will stay the course and adopt an organic approach, meaning I don't think they're necessarily going to go out and buy anything to accelerate or bolster their position in this vertical. Moving on, the second A in FAANGs is Apple. So Apple, what can we say about Apple that's not been said? This is a company whose life story is in multiple chapters. Obviously, initially Mac, then realistically, I would say maybe, Mac rose and failed and grew and stumbled. Really, I would say the resurgence of Apple can be traced back to the iPod. The iPod was almost the chassis on top of which the iPhone was launched. And I think once the iPhone launched, then Apple really became more of a mobile phone company. Let's be honest. Fantastic software, but really what explains Apple's billion-dollar valuation are not the Macs, not necessarily iPod or iTunes, although that was maybe the seed that spawned everything else, but really it's iPhone, even more so than iPad. But the fact remains that if you take a look at the reach and access that Apple has through consumers of the Mac, Apple TV, iPad, iPhone, you're talking about 1 billion plus installed consumer base, which is massive for any launch. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that despite the fact that Apple's DNA is not necessarily in media and content as an owner thereof, it shouldn't come as a surprise that eventually on November 1st of 2019, the Cupertino-based giant launched Apple Plus. Now, some people may say that it hasn't had the success early on that some expected, but the reality is that given that big consumer base and the fact that it has the balance sheet to essentially fund market share accumulation, it's done pretty well, and some of its shows, like The Morning Show, have actually been critically acclaimed. And I think that Apple, personally, I think they view this as a test. I think they view this as a test, meaning if Apple Plus works well, indeed, it may not scale as quickly as their core business. And I think given just how much money they have on their balance sheet, that may prove frustrating. If you think of the DNA of a technology, in a previous episode, we said how telecommunications firms and media firms are like the odd couple, right? It's a very different DNA culturally, but also of like the individuals that work at these companies. So the way that with telecommunications firms, you just invest in the satellites, the cable, and whatnot, and then you just replicate that and you get more, you lay down the fiber in more areas. With media, it doesn't really scale the same way. Just because you have a hit doesn't mean you're going to have another hit the day after. So my thinking is like that eventually, if Apple Plus initially works out well, they will probably see a reason and an incentive to basically stay in the game, because it's basically just another way to get people to buy more iPhones instead of Androids, more Macs instead of PCs. However, I don't think that they're going to want to stay the course independently. So my gut says that the same way that Apple a few years ago decided that they wanted to accelerate their strategy and they forked over a couple $2 billion for Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine's Beats company, my guess is that Apple will probably make a big splash. Now, it's either going to be a relatively bigger splash, meaning they may approach, instead of Jimmy Iovine, they may approach Jeffrey Katzenberg and say, look, if you've been able to take a couple $2 billion and get enough content in place for Quibi, build a slate, have the method to the madness, and you are our content wizard, well, here's a big check. Why don't you give liquidity to your many investors, who are all studios, by the way, so that gives Apple a very smart entry, not so much for what the catalog of Quibi may look like, but more to bring on Jeffrey Katzenberg and sign him to a big, long contract, but also tap into the studios that are all investors in Apple. Bear in mind, Apple has a couple $100 billion of cash on its balance sheet, which is an insane amount. So Quibi, having raised a couple $1 billion, would be a drop in the bucket for them. Now, of course, there's the big kahuna. They could decide that we don't want to make a small, big splash. We want to make the biggest of splashes. And there's a company that we're going to get to pretty soon that they may be eyeing, but more on that in a second. Moving along to the next letter in the FAANGs in alphabetical order is Facebook, but Facebook/Instagram. So what can I say about Facebook? So disclaimer, Facebook is one of our distribution partners. I do have communications with some of their colleagues. This stuff is all based on public information. I promise not to violate our NDAs and say anything that would get anybody in trouble. So Facebook is in a unique position, obviously. They got over 2 billion users, which is one of their key strengths. Indeed, the user profile is getting a bit older on Facebook, which is again an opportunity and a threat for them. But realistically, when it comes to video is less than 5% of Facebook's total business. Facebook has a lot of different lanes. And I think one of the reasons why Facebook has had a little bit of challenge being where it wanted to be with video is that, for one, Facebook, unlike say YouTube, isn't necessarily video-centric. The company's bread and butter, that news feed, was really more of like this flow of content and timeline where you had images, you had text, you had articles, and eventually you had videos, but it wasn't necessarily built for the kind of attention that the creators of the most premium forms of IP sought as a place and an environment to basically distribute their super premium programming. So I think to begin with, whereas sure, YouTube was also seen as like a UGC low quality platform, because it was all about the video and the page was really just dedicated to that one asset, I think YouTube had an easier time to overcome that association with this just being a chaotic place for content to live. So Facebook had some challenges inherently that were a bit harder to overcome. Second is just internally the culture. On any given day, Mark Zuckerberg is dealing with not just Facebook, not just election meddling, not just fake news, not just God knows what's happening with Facebook Live. there's other assets like WhatsApp and Instagram that have grown to be quite big. So I think when it comes to Facebook, it wisely realized that Instagram and IGTV may be a better platform over time for Facebook's video strategy, but we'll get to that in a second. What Facebook initially did outside of the feed, partly because it wanted to create a more bespoke environment and a more kind of dedicated environment for videos, but I also think a bit Machiavellian-like, I don't think Facebook wanted necessarily to share the bounty and the revenue from the feed, which is where most of the activity was. Remember, unlike Google and YouTube, whose DNA is all about revenue shares and giving money out and getting it back, so to speak, Facebook is all about sucking audience, traffic, and revenue in. Facebook is the company that goes to brands and says, pay me to access an audience. So I think initially by launching Watch, it both created a new environment, but it also kind of allowed it to buffer the bread and the golden egg, the golden goose, so to speak, of the news feed. But I think with Watch was just as chaotic as the feed in many ways. So I think in IGTV, which they bought Instagram for $1 billion, and now they've disclosed that Instagram generates $20 billion a year, I think it's given YouTube this ace to use that is not attached to the Facebook brand, that is a younger demo that Facebook has, and that will eventually give them time, I feel, to use either to go for short form content or actually to go long form that can maintain a certain low def sensitivity in terms of production, or it can actually become a platform for more bespoke events. So I think over time, there's something to be said about, could Instagram become bigger than Facebook? And then would video be larger on Instagram than on Facebook? That remains to be seen. If you think of their biggest hit, or one of their biggest hits, Jada Pinkett's Red Table Talk, you'd almost think that was like an accident. You'd almost think like Will Smith shows up for a meeting at Facebook, and in the end, he's like, yeah, you know what, I think I'm gonna keep my super premium ideas for Hollywood, but here's an idea that Jada's working on, why don't we run with this? And I'm using that not in a disparaging way towards either Jada or Facebook, but just saying that realistically, I think Facebook is still seen as, the second or third place that premium producers take their concepts to. And I think Mark Zuckerberg and his team have a lot of work to do there. They may not like hearing that, but I think that's just probably the perception that they still face. Moving along, let's talk about the next letter, the G being Google, but realistically when it comes to YouTube, we're talking about Google's subsidiary, YouTube. We've already talked about in the Netflix versus Google YouTube video about how YouTube is revolutionary. For the context of this video, what does that mean? Well, YouTube has changed the perception of quality. It has perception even the way we produce videos, straight to camera, you leave some of like the rougher editing styles. And frankly, the biggest change is, assume this is a remote control, the consumer now holds the remote control not just for the programming they want to watch, but also for the ads that they're going to sit through. At the lower right of your videos, you will see the skip ad button, which has totally changed the power dynamics from producer, distributor to consumer in some ways. I think YouTube has basically been always, early on in its life, YouTube punched above its weight because economically it was in this massive platform, but from an audience engagement, it was. I think that's changed. This year, finally, YouTube's revenues were broken out by Google. Revenue has doubled from 2017, about 8 billion gross to 15 billion in 2019. So we are under NDA. I'm not gonna comment about the rev share, but whatever you've read is probably accurate. Some people were quick to jump and say, oh my God, Instagram generated $20 billion and Facebook keeps that, but YouTube generated $15 billion and Google splits that. I think people are missing the point. I think the revenue share is what makes YouTube so attractive to content producers, whether it's WatchMojo, Little Joey in his basement, or frankly, MTV and whatnot. So I think the big opportunity for YouTube is maybe saying, forget the SVOD obsession that we had briefly, even the premium stuff, may make sense for us to go AVOD. I think if you think of that original pyramid where, they basically mastered that premium space in between, it's interesting because they conditioned the audiences and advertisers to be fine with user-generated content, and as that elevated to a prosumer field. And in many ways, the super premium content producers and IP holders, they almost evolved their strategy to adapt to YouTube. If you think about it, the late night show hosts, they basically started to produce segments and their shows for YouTube. Perfect case in point is getting Lily Singh. I don't think that was NBC hoping that Lily's fans would go and watch her on NBC. I think it was NBC saying, if we could get another big beachhead on YouTube, that's probably smart. And you're seeing celebrities, the Jack Blacks and the Will Smiths, embrace YouTube. And I think that just shows you how much YouTube has changed the landscape. So I don't actually obviously expect YouTube, that is the leader of this universe, to make any big acquisitions, and I mean to even suggest that they wouldn't be bullish long term. It's crazy talk. They're obviously going to stay the course, and I actually think that when you look at that $70 billion of TV ad market, that dam has broken. What do I mean? You could watch Game of Thrones on your mobile, and you may watch WatchMojo or PewDiePie on your desktop workstation or your smart TV. I think as those screens blur, as these distribution outlets become one, the value of a viewer is going to start to probably converge, whereby advertising will not be much more expensive on a TV than it is on mobile or workstation. And the main beneficiary of that is YouTube. Mobile remains the largest segment and platform on YouTube, but the fastest growing one is this bad boy behind me. So YouTube, obviously, I've always been a bull. When YouTube announced, I shared a bunch of screen grabs from my emails with Steve Chen, the co-founder early on, 2 articles I wrote about how YouTube is basically the greatest M&A deal of all time. And I don't want to say I told you so, but you know where I'm going with this. All right, so moving along, the next letter in the FAANGS is, of course, Netflix. Netflix is a fantastic story, founded in the late 1990s. Even though the name was Netflix, so you could argue that they always had this vision of eventually distributing their flicks over the net, it obviously started off with a very antiquated, especially with hindsight, model of shipping DVDs by the mail. Eventually, they embraced streaming, and the company took off. The rest is history. So when you think of Netflix, we don't need to add, obviously, in as much as YouTube is the leader in the AVOD universe, Netflix is the leader in the SVOD universe, subscription video on demand. And I would say as much as Netflix has rewritten the rules of Hollywood, it's more of an evolutionary play for me in that it basically takes content in a format and genre and style and length that we used to watch on big screens and theaters, and now we get to consume them on any screen whenever we want them. It's a high impact, a lot of change, but it's not really revolutionary in my humble opinion. That said, in M&A, you talk about gobble or being gobbled. And ultimately, M&A is a means to an end. Mergers and acquisitions are to help you grow. So I think for Netflix, absolutely, they will, I think, eventually get more aggressive. If you just think of the evolution, they took off, their subscribers took off when they launched House of Cards. Coincidence, causality, it doesn't matter. If you look at the graph, that's when the inflection point was. People are very quick to point out the main risk that they have, which is debt. And I think that is a valid concern. Interest rates are low now. Netflix can raise capital all they want. But whereas some of the bulls would argue that that debt allows Netflix to go out, raise more money to basically pour into more content that becomes their moat, I'm not necessarily sure it's that rosy, nor do I think that their debt is that risky. I think it's just part of the alchemy that Netflix as an executive team has managed to calibrate. I don't think traditional Hollywood companies would have been able to throw caution in the wind, embrace that much debt, lose money, and have supportive investors. And that's ultimately the same way as our previous episode. Telecommunications shareholders, media shareholders are very different if you really think about it. But because of vertical and horizontal integration and the synergy, sometimes they decide to get into bed together, but they're strange bedfellows, and hence the odd couple analogy. But I do think that the same way that Netflix took a risk and started to own IP, produce IP, not just license it, I think they foresaw wisely that eventually traditional media is going to say, why are we renting our premium IP to Netflix that is now our competition? And that did turn out to be right. I think Netflix will eventually buy companies outright. Does that mean they're going to go out and buy Lionsgate, which also owns Stars? Possibly. That could be a transaction that takes place. MGM recently hired some bankers and was shopping itself around. It's not unfathomable for Netflix to say, you know what, there's nothing precluding us right now from showcasing other IP, even though we produce our own IP. But instead of just producing IP and building that slate and building and beefing that up, which still takes time, why don't we just go and buy traditional archives and catalogs? If they buy MGM and say they own all the James Bond franchise, for example, that does give them a bit more of a moat than just saying that the debt we have allows us to go out and raise more cash to then build more content, and that's a moat. Well, wouldn't the biggest moat of all be just buying catalogs? So I think Netflix may eventually do that, but how much more debt they can raise to make those transactions remains to be seen. And their stock is expensive, right? Their market cap at about over $150 billion is quite rich, and on a price to revenue basis is even richer. So I'm not sure that the sellers of those catalogs and libraries are going to accept their stock. So the financial kind of arithmetic behind that gets a bit complicated. But since it's all about gobble or being gobbled, I did allude earlier that Apple could kind of make a small splash by buying something like Quibi for the reasons I alluded to, but they could also make a much bigger splash and go after something like Netflix, which would eat up pretty much most of the cash on their balance sheet. But considering how much they're printing money, that may actually be the best idea after all. Last but not least, Snap. So I'm including Snap in this list of FAANG to make it FAANGS, and Snap is not always included in this list, but I think in the last few years, you gotta give credit to this company that Facebook essentially showed an interest to buy, then more or less inspired itself from Snap's product line and faced considerable risks and threats from Facebook's total onslaught. Now, to me, and I think to most people, Snap is actually three things. You have the original communications platform, that goes back to that 6-second auto-delete messaging service. That's, I think, the lineage of Snap. I think the filters was something that created a lot of kind of meaningless fun for consumers, but was actually a really, really, really brilliant native advertising offering to Madison Avenue. And I think some of the success that Snap has had in winning over marketers is just how well they've been able to create this kind of native experience for marketers, which has won them a lot of love. But what Snap really deserves a lot of credit for the context of this episode and this show is really Discover. I think with Discover, it's as if they drew a Venn diagram and said, what's Facebook's challenge in the marketplace with marketers, and what is YouTube's challenge in the marketplace with marketers, and let's just basically exploit that. So, as I mentioned in a previous video, Snap is beloved by marketers, and seeing how marketers talk about it is quite impressive. So I think with Discover, Snap has taken a first step. Again, full disclosure, both partner via WatchMojo and own a few shares in the company. I think with Snap, with Discover, Snap has kind of wisely built this safe lane where content owners can basically take a lot of their existing content and adapt it for Snap audiences who frankly are not spending that much time on Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google's YouTube, or Netflix. And so for them, it's a new experience. We actually get people coming to us sometimes and saying, hey, I discovered WatchMojo through Snap. And we're like, oh, interesting, right? So I think it actually works as a first phase. Snap has also started to pursue license more bespoke projects that have higher production budgets. And my guess is that that is a test, right? These companies, this is how they operate. They don't just necessarily throw a big elephant in the pool. They dip their toes to decide what they want to do. It would not be crazy for Snap to use its soaring stock to maybe get a bit more aggressive in this space. I don't think, like a Netflix, they would go out and buy Lionsgate or MGM, or like an Apple, go buy Netflix. I'm not necessarily sure that they would do that, but I think Snap is in a more interesting position that they will probably want to go upstream and create, to some extent, ironically, I feel what Quibi is trying to do. The same way that Quibi was essentially the next iteration of Go90, Verizon's ill-fated project, I think a lot of what Quibi and Jeffrey Katzenberg and Meg Whitman's team are doing, I think Snap is looking at to then eventually say, if we had this kind of mobile-first audience and experience, and we are basically a phone company, and our audience is really kind of like lives and breathes in this format, how do we basically level up Discover so that we have more premium offerings to either under AVOD or an SVOD model generate more revenues? So Snap remains, and that's why I basically included them. Snap is a bit earlier in the evolution. A lot of times when we see what Facebook is going through, we kind of look back at a point in evolution of YouTube's trajectory. And I would say Snap is probably a bit further out, but that gives them actually a little bit of the benefit of the opposite of hindsight, foresight, I guess. So they kind of see what are the pitfalls that they want to avoid from Facebook and YouTube's playbook. And I would say that that's the one that it could go in many different directions. But all to say, it's very competitive and it's very cluttered to some extent. But these are 6 companies that have massive audiences. If you think of that New World Order, these are companies that have the big audience distribution box checked off. And I think they're playing in very different ways in the content space, whether they're licensing, whether they are investing themselves or outright eventually going out and buying catalogs of other content. I think you are going to see this as the new battleground in the 2020s. And if you're interested in the topic and you want to stay on top of what's going to happen, make sure to subscribe and check out our upcoming videos.